Céline Dion.
My dream, to be international star.
Could it happen again? Could Celine Dion happen again?
I'm Thomas Leblanc, and Celine Understood is a 4-part series from CBC Podcasts and CBC News, where I piece together the surprising circumstances that helped manufacture Celine Dion, the pop icon. Celine Understood, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
I say this a little bit as a content warning, but also because I just don't think it's fair to play it for you out of context. So, here is a US presidential candidate in the final 2 weeks of a close, high-stakes election, using some of his time on stage in front of thousands as well as live on cable television to discuss the size of a dead golfer's genitals.
This man was strong and tough, and I refuse to say it, but when he took showers with the other pros, they came out of there, they said, "Oh my God, that's unbelievable." I had to say it.
Yeah, so that's what's happening in America right now, and the polls are basically tied. In 2 weeks, this country will choose a president. And in the final stages of their campaigns, both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are using some unorthodox ways to get their messages out. So who are they trying to reach, and why? If these polls haven't moved much in months, could they really move now? And what is it like to be watching the final days of perhaps the most important election in American history, with so much at stake, just waiting to see if anything matters? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Aaron Rupar is one of our favorite American political correspondents. He writes the fantastic Public Notice, which you can find on Substack. Hey, Aaron.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
You're most welcome. Welcome back to the show. Before we get into as much substance as we can in the remaining weeks of this election, I have to ask you about Donald Trump's weekend with Arnold Palmer and McDonald's and this stuff. What is going on in Pennsylvania?
Boy, I wish I knew. It's pretty crazy stuff. Saturday, Trump had a rally in Pennsylvania where he began. It was in Latrobe, which I believe is where Arnold Palmer is from, who, Arnold Palmer being a legendary golfer who passed away in 2016, so a while back. And Trump was trying to pay tribute to him, but he did so in a way that only he can do, where he told this very long story about Arnold Palmer, and then at the end of it, mentioned that one of his virtues, as Trump saw it, is that when Palmer would shower with other golfers, they apparently were impressed at the size of his manhood. And so he discussed this, and it was one of those moments that, led me to thinking if Joe Biden did something like that, there'd be demands instantaneously that he, resign from office or be impeached. But with Trump, it was just kind of another Saturday night. And then Trump followed that up yesterday by doing a photo op at a Pennsylvania McDonald's. Of course, he did this because Kamala Harris worked at McDonald's when she was in college, but Trump has been insisting that this is a lie because there's no paperwork showing that Kamala actually worked there. Of course, local McDonald's aren't necessarily in the habit of keeping detailed paperwork on who works for them, 40 years ago. But leaving that aside, Trump saw this as an opportunity to kind of, portray himself as a friend to the working class, but in a very telling moment from that event. At one point, a reporter asked him if he supported increasing the minimum wage federally, and he dodged that question. So I think that kind of spoke to a little bit of the emptiness there where, it was a stunt, but it did get a lot of coverage, and it's generating a lot of discussion. And as always with Trump, it's hard to tell, whether just the fact that people are talking about him helps him. Sometimes I feel like it does, even though when you kind of unpack what's going on with something like the stunt that he did at McDonald's, I don't think it reflects super positively upon him or reflects policy proposals that he has that would actually help working people. But, sometimes just getting attention can be beneficial. And I think that's kind of what was going on with McDonald's thing.
When we talk about the rally and the mention of Arnold Palmer's genitalia, I'm asking you this because I know one of the things that you do is you basically cover almost every single Trump rally, breaking it down on social media for people. And I know we spoke in the summer and we kind of talked, he was talking about sharks and Hannibal Lecter. And I'm asking this kind of like, well, maybe not delicately, but is this getting weirder and weirder, or is it just me?
I think it is getting weirder and weirder. I really thought his rally on Saturday kind of stood out in that respect, where the Palmer thing was weird. But what was even more strange was that story that we were talking about that ended with the anecdote about showering, that went on for like 20 minutes, and it got to the point where it was kind of awkward and his crowd, was sort of silent behind him. And this is how he opened his rally. So, I think that part of it, he's a 70-year-old man. And he's keeping a very, very vigorous schedule that would be taxing for someone half his age. Like today, he's doing events across multiple states. He does these rally speeches, which are not like a Kamala Harris rally where, she does like a normal political speech. She'll speak for 20 to 30 minutes. And, she has some parts of it that change from day to day and she'll ad lib here and there. But, it's a typical political stump speech.
Right.
Whereas Trump, I think, feels like he has an obligation to his fans to do almost these kind of Castro-like, sometimes as long as 2-hour-long speeches that, are just very demanding and taxing for anyone. And I think you kind of couple that with, he has a very insular lifestyle. It's not like he's getting out there and kind of doing meet and greets with people who are, members of the public. It's a very kind of cloistered lifestyle that he has with his advanced age and the schedule that he's keeping. I do think it's getting weirder and weirder, but I think the bar is so low for him in a sense where, the Arnold Palmer thing has already kind of come and gone in terms of the news cycle and people have already sort of forgotten about it. So, this is part of his sort of the alchemy of Trumpism is that when there's just a blizzard of scandals day in and day out or blizzard of, obscene comments, none of them really seem to stick. And I think the people who kind of decide American elections tend to tune a lot of it out. So, we'll see. But I expect it to be a weird couple of weeks here, especially as Trump keeps up a very, very demanding travel schedule, which I think kind of wears him out and makes him weirder.
You mentioned that meanwhile, Harris is doing, the stereotypical political speeches and rallies. Is she trying to call attention to this kind of behavior? Is she leveraging it? This is the kind of thing that, well, yeah, to your point, I mean, if Joe Biden was doing it, it would be a top story. How's it being covered in the mainstream press and by Harris?
Yeah, Harris notably has started at her rallies playing clips of Trump comments. Last week, she repeatedly played the clip of Trump on Maria Bartiromo's show a week ago yesterday, where he talked about the enemies within, and he mentioned, the need possibly to deploy the military to deal with the enemies within, and he specifically mentioned Adam Schiff. So Trump supporters tried to spin those comments as being about undocumented immigration. But when you actually listen to the context of what Trump was talking about, it was very clear he was making actually distinction and saying these are not the migrants that he's constantly fear-mongering about. He was talking about, people on the left here politically. And so I think Harris, because these comments don't really break through like we were just talking about, I think she has kind of adopted the tactic of playing clips from Trump rallies to get that out there to her supporters, to get the media to cover those comments. And, she's made part of her stump speech an encouragement to her supporters or to, people who maybe are swing voters to actually watch Trump rallies, to see how weird they are. Because, I do think that the mainstream press has a tendency to sort of sanitize them in the sense that, with the Arnold Palmer comments, the New York Times had a reference in their live blog that referred to that as a Gulf story and did not mention, the broader context of what Trump was talking about, how bizarre it was. And so I think, I think there's almost like an embarrassment with some of these outlets where, they have a hard time engaging with Trump on the merits and they feel a need to kind of whitewash it for their readers. And so the sheer weirdness of Trump doesn't really break through. And so I think Harris has tried to kind of take matters into her own hands by showcasing some of this stuff at her rallies. And I do think it's been somewhat effective because, you get reporters covering the fact that she's playing these clips, explaining why it matters, and then kind of revisiting the stuff that Trump said that may have escaped broader attention when he actually said it.
Okay, in the context of all of this, a couple weeks left before Election Day, what do the polls say? Do I even want to know?
The polls are very, very tight. And I think that something that's kind of hard for people to wrap their minds around is that polling in races that are this close is not going to be super useful in terms of projecting who's going to win. Polling can tell you if someone is ahead. Some of these races, the Senate races where a candidate is ahead by 7 or 8 points, polling can tell you that someone is ahead. But when it's, a race that might be decided by, a few thousand votes, 10,000 votes possibly in a key state, it's just very hard to kind of tease that out in any sort of predictive way. There's too much noise. And so, I think the way that this is shaping up really looks like a coin flip election where I think the vast majority of the polling shows Kamala Harris winning the popular vote. So it seems kind of hard to imagine she won't win the popular vote. But then, of course, the winner here in the States is determined by the Electoral College. And that's where the picture is a little murkier because it's very possible she could win the popular vote by 2 or 3 points, but end up losing Pennsylvania, for instance, or Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, and wind up losing the Electoral College in a manner similar to how Hillary Clinton did in 2016. So, polling errors in the Trump era have been, a topic of a lot of conversation here in the States, where in 2016, the polls really underestimated his strength. And then again in 2020, that happened where, heading into election day, Biden in the national polling was ahead by 7 or 8 points. He ended up winning by 2 or 3, and it was kind of a nail biter. So there was a big polling error there. And since then, pollsters have made attempts to correct for that by, changing their samples to reflect, including more Trump supporters, changing the demographic breakdown of people that they poll. But I think there's still really an open question as to how effective those adjustments have been. There's actually kind of a polling error the other way a little bit in 2022, where a lot of forecasters were predicting a red wave election. And of course, that didn't really happen. And Democrats ended up holding on to the Senate.
Right.
And so there's a lot of uncertainty. And I don't think polling is going to help us determine that. I also don't think analyzing the early voting is going to be super helpful because this election is so different than 2020 when we were still in the middle of a pandemic. And so sadly, I think we're just going to have to, kind of accept the fact that we're not going to know. And if you're the type of person, who is inclined to get out there and, canvass, door knock, try to get people to go vote, I think that's a better way to kind of channel your anxiety doing constructive things than fretting over polling.
Both of these campaigns have been trying to reach new and untraditional audiences. Can you explain a little bit about how they're doing that?
Yeah, that's been a really interesting dynamic of this election that I think is a little bit different even than in 2020, where Trump, for instance, has really been trying to make inroads with young male voters. And so last week he did one of the Barstool podcasts, which has a very young male audience. He's been doing other podcast hits with right-wing commentators that, kind of live on YouTube. So, kind of going around the mainstream media to appeal to specific demographics. And Kamala Harris has been doing something similar. She was on I'm going to blank on the name of somebody. I believe it's called the Call Me Daddy podcast or something like that.
Call Her Daddy.
Call Her Daddy. See, I knew that I had that slightly wrong.
Massive podcast.
I know it's a massive podcast, so I feel bad getting it wrong, but it's not one that I personally listen to. So
right.
I basically learned about what it was through her appearance there. And she was on The View recently, which is a little more of a traditional format, but, appealing to women. And so both candidates have, kind of tried to shore up either areas where they want to make inroads or, try to kind of consolidate their base by doing non-traditional media. And, this comes as Trump obviously is kind of stiff-arming 60 Minutes. He didn't want to do the traditional sit-down interview with them. And, he ducked out of doing a second debate with Kamala Harris. And Harris hasn't sat down with the New York Times and has kind of avoided some of the legacy outlets that, the Biden administration, which she, of course, is a part of, has had a fraught relationship with. And so this seems to be kind of a new frontier of campaigning, instead of doing traditional campaign events or, doing an interview with the New York Times or Washington Post, take advantage of these new forms of media to speak to specific audiences in different sorts of ways.
You mentioned that this election is different from 2020, obviously, because the pandemic has faded. I am interested in that dynamic when it comes to media and them doing podcasts like this. Like, do we have any sense of who they're reaching, how effective it is, what these conversations are like? Or does this change too fast these days for us to have a sense of how effective this is as a communication tool for votes, if not just, for getting a message out?
Yeah, I have not seen any specific data that would indicate one way or the other whether, going on a specific podcast is effective. I mean, I guess ultimately it's going to boil down to who wins the election. And I think that you would see the impact of these things show up in polling if it was dramatic. And, one of the interesting things about this race is that since Kamala Harris became the candidate in late July, it's been a remarkably static race where, within about a week or so of her ascending to the top of the ticket, she was ahead by about 3 or 4 points, and it has basically stayed there nationally. And of course, there's been some changes in some of the swing states, which have tightened a little bit. So to that extent, where you would expect the impact of doing, major podcasts to possibly show up in polling, we haven't really seen that. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see on November 5, and then, we can kind of Monday morning quarterback from there.
Is there anything left that could shift the status of this race? To your point, these polls have barely budged. We've seen lots of bizarre behavior. What's out there that could still make an impact? The proverbial, I guess, October surprise.
Yeah, so last week, Kamala Harris was working really hard to make direct appeals to Republican-leaning voters, and she's hitting the trail with Liz Cheney. Which is another example of trying to, kind of make a pitch to one of the last constituencies that is unpolarized, so to speak, which are kind of these like center-right voters. So along those lines, I think, we've seen Mark Milley, a former top general under Trump, who in a book described Trump as being fascist to the core, which has got some pickup. And I've seen, people kind of urging people like Milley or John Kelly, Trump's former chief of staff, to get in front of cameras and, kind of make an endorsement of Kamala Harris and be a little bit more public about it. Would something like that really make a huge difference at this point? I'm not totally sure, but it seems like the Harris campaign has identified these center-right voters as, one of the last population groups or voter blocks where she could pick up a percentage point or two maybe, and that would really make a difference. And on the other side with Trump, of course, in 2020, we had the Hunter Biden laptop, which Trump tried to make a big October surprise, but it fell kind of flat. And this year, I wouldn't be surprised if, something like that came up where he tried to create some new scandal out of whole cloth to smear Harris with, but it's really hard to know what that would be ahead of time. It seemed like he tried to do a little bit of that with the hurricanes that hit the southeast of the country, lying about the FEMA response and trying to make it seem as though the Biden administration was actually slow-walking disaster relief to kind of punish Republican voters, which of course didn't happen and wouldn't make any sense because those are states that Harris needs to win. And I do think that, the polls have tightened in the Southeast a little bit. So I'm not exactly sure what accounts for that, if some of Trump's lying kind of broke through or if there's something else going on there. But it's hard to imagine in a race that has been sort of this, I don't know if ugly is the right word, but, it kind of feels like Trump has already emptied the bag on Harris in terms of oppo. So I'm not really sure what else he has left, but, maybe it could be something that's responsive to news events. I mean, God forbid that the war in the Middle East escalates to more of like an open, hot confrontation between Iran and Israel. I think something like that could potentially benefit Trump, and Trump has been very open that he's speaking on a near daily basis with Netanyahu. So, there could be kind of global events of that sort, that could kind of destabilize things or inject an element of chaos into the race that I think would help Trump. But again, this has been a very, very static race, and I think we're seeing that based on these highly targeted pitches that each campaign is making to voters that they think they can, make gains with. But I have a hard time seeing, this race, which has been very static, changing in a dramatic way over the last 2 weeks.
What will you be watching for then as we get down to the final hours?
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of nearing a point now where I'm not sure how useful polling is because so many people are voting early.
Right.
There's a lot of votes that are being banked. And so, if you've already voted and then something happens that maybe would change your mind, I mean, it's kind of too late, obviously. So, I'm just watching as part of my beat all of the campaign events to kind of get a flavor for what the closing messages are. I mean, obviously, we talked about Trump's weekend, and I didn't foresee his closing message being discussing the genitalia of golfers, but here we are. And on the Harris side, I think she's making kind of a pitch to patriotism, to, the sense of duty that, center-right voters might have to defend the Constitution and vote for her. So that's kind of, I'm very kind of tuned into, the messaging more so than the prognostication or the early vote totals and things like that. And, I think we're kind of in a weird liminal state right now where I'm not sure how much anything that happens at this point matters. But, we're all kind of, the stakes are so high that, any indication here on the margins that, something could be good or bad for these campaigns could make a huge difference. And so, even if it turns out that developments over these last 2 weeks don't matter and that, the cake is already baked, so to speak, I'm watching all these campaign events just to get a flavor of what the campaigns are saying.
The last question for you, and we up here in Canada have a small benefit of being a little bit removed from this, even though obviously it's a huge impact to us. So Canadians are paying close attention. But I'm wondering just what it's like for you to be in that kind of liminal state you just described, with an incredibly tight race that you described as possibly a coin flip, knowing the stakes of this election and everything that will happen immediately after the polls, to be sitting here waiting now for, I guess, just the result.
Yeah, it's really strange. Just personally, my family and myself, we're kind of in between situations with housing. Like we have a lot of housing uncertainty right now. And honestly, the election is kind of a big factor where, if Trump wins, I think, my willingness to maybe return back to the Washington, D.C. area will be a lot less than it would be otherwise. So, there's kind of a lot riding personally on this election. And that's just kind of one small slice of life. I mean, if you are a dreamer in this country, the dreamers being undocumented immigrants who have lived here since they were babies or kids, you can imagine that, your whole future might be riding on this thing. Trump has been talking very openly about deporting immigrants who are here who have legal status. Some of the Haitian migrants in Ohio, where, they've obviously become kind of a front line of demonization as Trump makes his case, fear-mongering about immigration. These people could have, they could be deported if Trump wins. And so, I think it's going to be incumbent upon all of us, like you kind of alluded to and like we talked about earlier. This is a coin flip election. So I think it's going to be incumbent on Americans to kind of think through, what they plan to do if Trump wins. We're all going to wake up the next day and it's not like life is going to end. And I think it's going to be very important for Americans to, remind themselves that, solidarity with people who are at risk because of Trump's policies is going to be very important, and to try and keep an open mind and an open heart. I think if Kamala Harris loses, there's going to be a lot of recriminations, a lot of second guessing, a lot of blame, as to why that happened. And that's natural. But I think, ultimately we're going to have to try to, maintain a sense of solidarity and care for our neighbors and understand that it won't be the end of the world. And we're going to have to make the best out of it. I think a lot of people thought that the world was ending after Trump won the first time. And certainly that was a very, very tough 4 years, and many lives were lost, in particular because of the COVID response or lack thereof. So it'll be difficult times, but, we'll just have to forge ahead, and hopefully it doesn't come to that because, I think there are good reasons to be optimistic about Harris's chances. I just think that the fact that the election is so close is really difficult for me to wrap my mind around. And I think that's the case for a lot of other Americans who think like I do as well.
Aaron, thanks so much for this, and good luck the next 2 weeks.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Aaron Rupar, the author and editor of Public Notice. That was the big story. For more from us, including previous appearances by Aaron and other American correspondents, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. We would love some feedback on how we cover the U.S. election. Frankly, I'm not sure what to make of it right now, so I just ask Aaron what the hell's going on, and that's what he tells me. But if you have a better idea, by all means, we're always ready to hear it. The way to do that is with an email to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or a phone call to 416-935-5935, where you can leave us a voicemail that I and Joe will listen to personally. We may not agree, but we'll listen. And, of course, you can find The Big Story in all of your favorite podcast players, which includes Seeker, Seekr, if you haven't checked it out already. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.